Hi everybody, this is Joy at Red Pine Quilt Shop. Today we're going to talk about how to sew the ends of your binding together when you're binding a quilt. So I'm going to start by talking about the simplest method, which is simply to tuck your end together. So to do that, the first thing you need to do is to actually cut your first binding strip at a 45-degree angle. I like to do that with my quick trim ruler. It has 45-degree lines on the ruler just designed exactly for that task. So I'll line a line up with the side, I'll line a line up with the top of the end of my binding strip, and then I will go ahead and trim. And now I have a 45-degree angle to get started with my binding. That's going to be the tucked end. Now the first thing that I would do with this is to go ahead and fold it over 1/4 of an inch. I don't have an iron here, but I would go ahead and press that really well because I want this end to be finished, and then go ahead and fold it back. And I've already in advance pressed my binding strip in half and press it really well so that I have finished both this side and this side by folding that edge under. So tuck it back about 1/4 of an inch, press it really good, and then you are ready to start to sew the binding to your quilt. So when you start to sew the binding to your quilt, if you're doing the tucked end method, I like to lay that binding strip down on the edge of my quilt. I have not trimmed my quilt top yet here. My top end's right here. I've got batting and backing sticking out here yet because I've not trimmed it yet. But I will lay it down and I will open the binding, and I'm gonna sew at the 1/4 inch mark up to where that hits, and I'm going to go probably about 2 inches further. And at that point I'm just sewing through one layer. I've opened my binding up because I don't want this tail moving around on me. I want it to stay put. So I will sew right up until where that flap is and another couple inches through just a single layer of binding to stabilize that tail. And then I'm going to jump to about an inch from where that folds down, and I will go ahead and start backstitch a couple stitches. You can see there's my tail. I backstitched 3 stitches, and then I started to sew my binding on. And I will go ahead and sew my binding on and come all the way around the quilt till I get to where I'm hitting that corner. At that point in time, I want to get my tail tucked in, and I left an inch here because I want to tuck it and get it tucked under. So now I can go ahead and open that up, lay my binding in. I'm going to trim it so it's trimmed someplace. You know, I tried to get pretty close to where I was getting at least probably a 3/4 of an inch tuck, trim it off, and now I am ready to go ahead and sew that final length of the seam. So at your starts and your stops, you always want to backstitch a couple stitches, and then you'll simply tuck that tail in and then finish sewing your binding. But make sure you're tucking at least a 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch in, because you want to have that tucked good. And at that point in time, when you flip this over, you'll have a finished end. You're going to see a little flap there, but it's finished because you folded that 45-degree angle piece under before you started. So that is how to do a tucked end binding. If you would like to sew your binding ends together, that is the second method. When I'm planning to sew my ends together, I always give myself about an 8 to 10 inch gap. So when I started sewing the binding, I left a tail. I would go all the way around my quilt. When I came around the other side, I would stop and backstitch and leave myself an opening that's 8 to 10 inches. Because you need to have a little bit of slack there to work with. The next thing that you need to do is to trim your ends. So I like to lay these down and just stagger them a bit so I can see where they both are. I generally will find the middle, and I have 2.5 inch binding, so if my middle is here, I want to go about 1.25 inches that way, so half of the width of the binding. And that is where I will trim one of my strips at. So the midpoint plus about 1.25 inches. And then I'll lay my other binding strip down, and this one has already been trimmed, but I'll lay it down. And the way that I measure how to trim is I actually use the tail of my binding. So normally I have extra binding and I have a big long tail here, and I'll just flip that tail over, and the overlap amount, this is a different color binding, but it's the same width. The overlap amount should be the width of your binding. So I will actually let this big long tail hang out here. I will lay that down and line it up with the piece that's jogged out here. And then I can actually just flip this over and take a scissors and trim. And after I trim, I will come back and I will cut off about another 1/8 of an inch, because there's always a little bit of stretch, there's always a little bit of give, and if I actually cut it at the width of the binding and didn't trim that additional little 1/8 off, I would end up with a pucker usually at the end. So I trim it and then I take off another 1/8, and you can see this one's already been cut. You can see how it's just slightly shorter than the width of the binding, but that's the amount that that overlap should be. And when you have it ready like this, at this point you're going to go ahead and sew that seam at a 45-degree angle. So I will open my top piece up right side up. I will take the other piece, and here's where you need to have that little bit of fabric, because I got to bunch this up so I can get up here and work with these two strips. So the one is right side up, the other one I'm going to open right side down, and you do want to be careful to not put a twist in these. So one is right side up, one is right side down, and I will line those two ends up. So I'm kind of making a square there, and then I will pin, and I will pin. 2 pins is usually good. And at that point in time, I can take a small ruler and a marking pencil, and I can line up with the corners and draw a line, and that's where I will go ahead and sew my seam. Now, after you've sewn that seam, one thing that you really want to always do is you want to sew that seam, and before you trim anything off, you want to go ahead, and this is not sewn, it's just pinned, but you want to go ahead and check and make sure that you got it sewn well and that you didn't get a twist and run of your strips. And do make sure that you check it before you trim that extra end off. And once you've done that and you've checked that it's good, you can trim that end off. I like to press those seams open. I use my fabric folding pen for that because I don't want to have to hassle with running over to the ironing board, so I can just take my fabric folding pen and put a little bit of that solution on, easily press that seam open, and then I'm ready to come back and finish sewing that last little length of binding, that 8 to 10 inch section that I left open so that I could work with it. But you do want to leave yourself that much because you've got to get that out and under your sewing machine. So you want to make sure you give yourself a little bit of room to work with. So that is how to connect your binding ends, either with the tucked method or with the actual sewing the ends together method. We've been doing a continuing series on binding, so definitely search our YouTube channel for binding and you will find some additional presentations on the topic of binding your quilts. So we hope you enjoyed this one. You can find the items that I shared with you, the quick trim ruler and the fabric folding pen. You can find both of those items on our website at www.redpinequiltshop.com. Thanks for joining us.